start recording here. And then I'm also gonna make sure that we're kind of starting from scratch here. So as y'all know, in part one, we did a lot of fun stuff on the road to building our JavaScript project. Main things we did was really like take the time before we coded to check the project requirements, ideate, right? Think about what we want to build and make sure it's something we're actually passionate about, because we are going to spend hours on this project, right? So we really want to make sure it's something we care about and something our heart is in. And then we moved on to wireframing and kind of like thinking about our user stories. And in that piece, we wrote down our models, their attributes and their associations. And really all of this hard work can be found in this part one notes file that is in this directory. It's also pushed up to GitHub as well. So if you want to review what happened in part one, you will be able to do that in the repo. But again, we thought about what our models are going to be, their attributes and their associations. And then we went ahead and we started building. We talked about how and why we're using a Postgres database, and we talked about why we're specifically using an API flag, right? This is only going to be an API. We do not need all of the Rails juice that usually comes with just a Rails application. We created a repo, and we also talked about a development flow that is more common when you get to a dev team. It's this idea of like working on a feature in a branch and then merging that branch to master, ensuring that the master branch always has like reliable and working code, so that if all hell breaks loose on your branch, you can delete the branch. You can just move on and start from master, start all over with some fresh working code. Lastly, we did the fun part, which was, you know, all of this is fun, but really this part 8 is when we really start to code. And we generated our models, our migrations, our associations, and all of that good stuff. And we created some seed data and adjusted our migrations as needed. Again, all of this can be found in this file. But also in part one, we had some questions that came up, right? Should we do our migrations in separate branches? And then also, what is the belongs to attribute in migrations doing for us, right? What's the best practice? Y'all raised this in the last session, and I didn't have kind of a full body answer. So I was like, you know what I do, and this is why I like to have like note markdown files in my project as I'm building, is questions will arise, but it never doesn't make sense for me to go down a rabbit hole. But when we're done with that part, when we're done with that coding session, it does make sense to say, okay, let's take a break and let's actually ask some of these questions and research some of these questions that came up for us. And so the first one, why do we do our migrations in our respective branches? And basically we want to fully build out the feature in our respective branch, right? So we don't want to merge a migration file, right, to master that hasn't actually been successfully migrated, because this compromises our master branch. So this is something that I kind of goofed up on last session, where I did not do all of our migrations when we were in our respective branches. And that is something that I do recommend you all do. So as I was migrating the syllabus or building out that syllabus branch, building out that model, regdb migrate, right? And then push up to master. Anyone have any questions about this before we move on to the second question that came up in part one?
So wait, Ayana, like say if you have to, for any reason, do a rollback and either, I guess, depending on the models.
Yeah.
But normally, so like in the master?
Yeah, stuff like that where I don't want to get too exhaustive. Stuff like that, I would just roll back in the master. That's it's a personal project, so it's not, the stakes aren't so high that we can't do like little tasks on our master branch. But when thinking about building out a new feature from start to finish is something we want to make sure we're keeping on a branch as to our best ability. Sometimes it doesn't happen, right? Like in part one, but in other times when we can control it and we're looking out for it, that's the best way.
I have a quick question. Why didn't we migrate before we merged?
Yeah, so that's what we're answering, right? We should have. And that's one thing I goofed up on. So we did the migrations, we did the associations, we built up the model, and then I just merged to master and I closed that branch. And then after my 2 migration files were in, I did a rake db migrate in the master branch. And that is something I would not recommend that y'all do. But it happens. It wasn't the end of the world. The migration was successful, so wasn't too big of a deal. But if something started to happen where, okay, we really needed to like shift some things around, it would have been better to like shift those things around in a branch. All right. So that was kind of like the first lesson here, right? Like migrate in our respective branches. And then the second question that came up is like, what does the belongs to attribute do for us? And like, what is best practice? So long story short is the belongs to attribute in migrations will actually index our association. And for y'all to see what some folks may be like, well, what are you talking about? So I'm going to share my screen here. Essentially, if you have ever seen this in a migration, right? You generate a migration and you have like this belongs to attribute. Under the hood, it is essentially doing this, where we're going to add a reference, and it's going to look like this in our schema. So I, in these notes, have a whole bunch of different links and ways we can piece this all together. But I wanted to give y'all a visual of what's actually happening. So this belongs to, this Stack Overflow answer actually gives a good explanation. And again, y'all can go down these rabbit holes because I provided links, but someone was asking kind of the same thing here, right? Like what's this belongs to in your Rails migration do? And this answer I thought was super helpful where, right, something like T dot belongs to category, which is very much so what we were doing in our application, is a special helper method of Rails passing the association. We can click on that. Really isn't a helpful link, but let me try to reopen that close tab, close on accident. And let's go back to that. But then this is the point, this is the part that I think is most helpful, is if you look at the source code to belongs to, it is actually an alias of references. And if you want to get super nerdy, we can look at some Rails source code, but we are not going to do that today. But if we go back to our repo, essentially what's happening is this is happening under the hood. It's creating a big int attribute, and it's creating an index. Index syllabuses on category ID. This is why it's super important. So there is this article. If someone, I'm going to share this link and see if I can. Let's actually open up because I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I do want to make sure we do spend at least some time on this so that y'all can ask any questions you may have. I'm going to drop a link in the chat. If someone can open that link and share their screen, go ahead and do that for us, and we'll walk through this together. So anyone who has that link pulled up in their browser, go ahead and share your screen, because we're gonna look at it. We're gonna look at it together. Nice, thanks, Meg. Cool. So this is a really good article that I found. So like why it's important to index our associations. You scroll, he kind of goes through the nitty gritty here, but if you continue to scroll down, Meg, it goes through how it's basically a performance boost, and why it's best practice to index our associations instead of creating a plain old integer. And so this is the thing. It says I can run this query on a database which randomly populated with 1 million rows and see how long it takes. We scroll down. This is just like, this is some, now we're getting, okay. So although my query is simple, it took 1.42 seconds. And that's because we were just doing it with an integer to user ID and kind of creating, basically hard coding that foreign key association, which is what we did in part 1. But then it says, if we do the same exact thing and add an index on user ID, then it goes from over 1.4 seconds to about 100th of a second. So read more into this article. It's a lot of kind of like database, cool, nerdy stuff, but essentially indexing our databases boosts the performance of our application. And thank you so much for sharing that for us, Meg. This becomes less important, right, at an application our size, but more important when you're working on larger applications. And I really wanted y'all to point this, bring this up and kind of like put a highlight on this in case you join a dev team and you are working on a Rails application and there are 1 million queries to the database, let's say. Stuff like that really, really does make a huge difference. So I wanted to make sure we covered that. So go ahead.
Oh, Ayana, I just wanted to say I was the one that asked that question last week, and I did see yesterday I was looking in the Rails guides under creating a migration.
Yeah.
They had like a link to the API docs for adding references.
Yes.
And I saw like the same thing you mentioned, that reference is an alias for belongs to.
Yeah.
Oh, so do you have a link to that in there?
Yeah, so I have some links here. These are all, again, this is pushed up on the repo. I don't know if it has the exact, I don't know if I found the exact article that you're talking about, but feel free to share that as well. Yeah. And thank you for raising this, right? So before, our migration looked like this. It was an integer category ID on the syllabus table. This is actually that practice when you're working on a large scale application, because of the performance issues that you can read more about in the links shared. What I did was created another migration to remove this column. Although I said string, this is actually that's actually a typo, but it removed it for us. And then I created a new migration called add category to syllabus. And then I did this add reference migration here on the syllabus table for our category, foreign key true. What this created, that migration also had this, and this is for folks that are following along here. That migration also had this null false. I had to take this out because Postgres didn't like it. I ran rake demigrate. This is what our schema looks like now. And then it has add foreign key down here, and it has an index as well. And then to the seed file, I just added some destroy alls, and I added, so if you look at here, I added destroy alls to what we currently have in here. And then if you look at our models, to the category, I added this dependent destroy. I had to add this now that we're indexing it. it would not let me do the delete when I had the destroy all in there if I did not have dependent destroy. Basically meaning like destroy that entire association. And then I had to basically run rake db reset, which drops, creates, and reseeds the database. So I did want to make sure we touched on this so that you all kind of know how the application has changed and what research we did offline that kind of necessitated those changes. And thank you so much for asking that question, Meg, because it was such a good question. And it turns out like that's indexing our associations and our foreign keys is really, really important. Anyone have any questions about that? I'm going to check the chat here.
Could you also paste the repo for your notes?
Yes.
I don't see it in the chat.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the repo here. Good call. So I'm going to, I'm just going to refresh that page. Cool. And I'll drop this repo in the chat. So this is also this is the pushed up code that we've been working with. And if you look at part 2 notes, this will all that good stuff will be in there.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you. I know I was looking up cabin retreats for my birthday. So it's like, what can I do for my birthday and still socially isolate?
You can also do it when you do generate your model. Yeah. You can just put the belongs to after the colon.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. When we do Rails G model, right, for syllabus, I can do category references. What that will do will generate a category ID column in syllabus, and then it will also modify the syllabus RB model to add a belongs to category relationship. So that can, yes, you're correct, Connie, that can all happen actually in our generator here. Awesome. All right, y'all. So now that, and this is what we're going to do moving forward. If any questions arise in here and it takes some extra research on my part, I'll just research it and we'll answer those questions and kind of review in our next session. But I want to make sure we get to part 2, right? Which is actually going ahead and building out our routes and our controllers and using the fast JSON API serializer. Meg, you are an angel for asking that question. So cool. Let's go ahead and move on to our routes here. I have a question. When we are stuck, can we reach? Yeah, so I'm going to pause for questions throughout this project build. If you have kind of a larger question about your project specifically, feel free to Slack me or join one of the office hours. But I'll open it up for questions after we kind of start working through this first piece, which is going to be getting our routes up and running in our application. So as it stands, right, our models are all set up, our database is set up, everything's migrated, the seeds are working as expected. We're referencing and indexing our foreign keys. But now let's talk about models. Our routes. And again, we're kind of following along using this, let me see if I can find this, the API setup, that API project setup that we're doing here, right? So in here, they go through namespace routes, example controller, all that good stuff. And they go through why, but I'm also going to reiterate that here. And there's a couple of reasons to namespace your routes. Again, remember, we are building this project with the expectation or the assumption that we are going to deploy it and host it at a domain at some point. namespacing your routes becomes super important and super helpful. For one reason is you can indicate that it's associated with an API, right? So, right, we said naming our apps can be fun. So I've named my app CETA, and CETA.com ideally should show the front end, right? But then if we go to CETA/API, right, that indicates that the endpoint that I'm calling to is an API endpoint and not just a front end endpoint. So that's why we namespace. Other reason is we can namespace based on version, right? So we can have some version control when it comes to our API. Let's say this is like the beta version of my API, right? And I want to create a different version with some more tests and different functionality. I can create a version 2 of my API. Let's say I've added some new features. There's some new associations there. I can create version 2 of my API and make calls from that endpoint in my front end. So I know which version of the API I'm calling from in my front end. So that's a quick note on why we want to namespace our routes. Does anyone have any questions before we actually go ahead and jump into our code to do that? Close out some of this real quick. Cool. And again, this should look kind of familiar, this nesting syntax. This kind of harkens into how we nest things in Rails. So this should feel familiar. Let's go ahead and actually start building out our routes so we can start going to these specific endpoints and testing our application. And where do I find my routes? Which file am I going to go to here? Where can I find that?
The
config routes.
That's exactly right, y'all. So I'm going to go into config and I'm going to go into my routes here. And again, I'm going to namespace. Let me make sure. That's one word. Namespace, right? And then the first level is going to be API.
Ayana, quick question while you're typing that in. When you're doing the stuff in the controller, do you need to be cautious about the namespace, or Rails kind of knows that you don't? Cool.
Yes. Okay. So I'm making all these sound effects, forgive me, because you are kind of like foreshadowing the next step here. So I'm going to go ahead and namespace these. I'm going to create another end, and then we need like a third tier as well. So this is going to be indented here, indented here. Cool. So the first level is going to be our API. The next level, right, is going to be our version. Oh, there's only 2 levels, so that's my fault. We can actually get rid of one of these. So first level is API. Next level is going to be version. So this is going to be V1 for us. And then in here is where we will actually, right, prescribe that route. And we're doing a route for syllabus. Cool. And we want to also make sure, right, this is plural. And again, since we're building vertically, we really only want to do the index route for right now. I see it so many times where, first of all, like we're doing for all routes, and then we talked about this last time, and then we build a controller out with all of our controller actions without testing nothing. And then, right, we don't end up using like 3 of those like those methods, right? So we just have like all this code bloat in our application. So we're only going to focus on our index for now. I'm going to make sure I have this syntax right. Yep, API do, right? And it's plural and only index for now. Any questions about this before we move on to that ever like kind of like right time, right place question that Adam asked about how this may affect our controllers? Cool. All right, so we've implemented our routes. So part one is done. And how can we confirm these routes? How can we confirm that we set these routes up properly? What can we
You can run Rails routes.
That's exactly right, Carrie. So I'm going to go ahead and run Rails routes here because that's how I'm going to be able to see if this is running as we expect it to. So Rails routes. Uh-oh. All right, so we got some sort of error, some sort of syntax error here. Let's double check that. Looks like, so I'm missing that little semicolon there. And that is where it was failing in our code. So our code was nice enough to tell us, okay, there's something going on right there. It was expecting something.
The caret is pointing at the bracket. So is it like, just because it's like, okay, and then it sees the bracket and it's like, wait a second, because that colon wasn't there?
Exactly. That's exactly right. It like sees this only and it's like, okay, whatever, maybe that's a variable. And then it's like, wait, what happened here? We're missing something. So we just needed that colon.
I was about to ask if your elephant was running.
My little elephant is always running, poor guy. Okay, so and by elephant we mean that Postgres elephant, y'all. We were talking about this yesterday in the office hours, but it looks like I have my index route. We can kind of ignore the rest of these. This is like some Rails stuff that's happening.
Because that comes with automatically, right? With the action mailbox.
Yeah, Mandrill. It's like a way to send mass emails. I don't know why that comes automatically, but it does.
I think you can get rid of it in like big.
Yeah, definitely could. But yo, we have this index route. So that looks like it was set up successfully, and we can officially kind of check that off of our checklist here. Yeah, so that's done, and we can run Rails routes, right, to confirm those routes. But what would happen if I, in my Chrome, decided I was going to go to localhost 3000 API? Yeah, what would happen if I were to go here? And I'm going to make sure I run my server, so that's not the issue. So my server's running, right?
You get an error because, oh wait, no. Yeah. Huh.
Yeah, I get an error. Why is this?
No initialize constant API.
So I wanted to show y'all this error because I'm getting this. Go ahead.
What the controller code look like?
Exactly. There's no controller code, Sushi.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why I'm getting this error. So let's actually go back and let's like actually address this controller issue. As Adam mentioned, with these namespace routes, is our controller going to look a little bit different? And how does that manifest with this namespacing? Again, we're going to run a generator, but in that generator, we're going to be doing something a little special here, where we're going to do API/v1/whatever our controller name is. And let's go ahead and see how that looks, how that generates a controller that looks a little different here. So I'm going to quit my console. I'm going to command K here, and I'm going to do Rails G controller, because I want to generate a controller. And again, because my routes are namespaced, I'm going to do API, the first level, then versions, the second level, and then the controller that I want to generate is going to be my syllabus controller. remember our controllers are always going to be plural. So I did syllabuses here because Rails does not give us that pluralization for syllabi. But now I should see a controller. I should see actually an API folder in my controllers file or my controllers folder. And then in there, I also see a version folder. And then I see my syllabus controller reflecting my name spacing in my routes here. So Adam, that is going to be the many ways in which this is, or the two ways this is different. You brought up an excellent point. Since we are name spacing and kind of like nesting our resources for our syllabus in these like namespace routes, what that looks like is first, our generator is going to be a little different where we're going to do API v1 and then we'll have our syllabus controller because we want to create these different folders, this file structure, but then we also want to kind of be explicit about how this controller is kind of declared here as well to reflect that those routes. Does this help answer your question, Adam?
Yes, yes. Cool. I was looking for the
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the part about namespacing, like the V1, can you go over that again? Like, why is that necessary, I guess?
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question. Because it is unnecessary. It's not necessary, right? This does not like make or break our application, but it becomes helpful because again, if we want to deploy this, then we are calling from, right? So let's say in my browser, I have, I'm doing like ceda.com, right? ceda.com is going to actually take you to the front end deployed version of my application once I deploy it, right? You should only see the JavaScript client, the front end client. But in my code, I'm not going to be able to fetch requests from ceda.com, right? If I deploy my backend, we're going to want to use our domain name, but we're going to want to be explicit about the fact that it's an API, right? So that when other developers and even us are looking and programming in our front end, we know we're fetching from this API endpoint.
I got a quick follow-up question for that. Is that, you know how we're doing like the different branches? Is part of the reason you would do like a version 1 is that then when you're building version 2, you just do version 2 as its own branch? I mean,
Exactly.
Like
so go ahead.
I understand the reason we put the API part, but like the version part, that's just more convention than anything.
Yeah, exactly. So let's say version 1 is the MVP of this application, and I'm fetching from version 1 in my front end. But then let's say I want to update this. I want to make some changes, right? I want to add some features. Then I'm going to create version 2 of my application or version 2 of my API, and then we'll fetch from that instead on the front end. So it gives us some like version control in that sense. Excellent questions, y'all. Cool. So we went over namespacing our routes, and then we also now have a controller. I think it totally makes sense to be committing at each step here, right? I did not do that branch thing that y'all have seen me do throughout. I'm just going to wait until I have my routes and my controller built out, and then I'll like create a branch for that, or I'll branch out for that and push that up. I'm sorry, I'll do a git push but then I'll create a new branch for my serializer. I didn't want to do this exactly as I would do it because I would take away time. But when you're doing your project, right, I would have a new branch for your routes for syllabus, and I would merge that. I would do a new branch for when you're finished your controller and merge that. And I can, you know, do git commits. Committing as often as possible is always a good idea. But I'm not going to do the usual kind of like branch off as often as I usually would, just because we have a finite amount of time together and I want to make sure we're getting to everything here. But I'm going to do syllabus, route, and generated controller. I'm going to push that. Cool. I'm going to make sure I'm looking at the chat. Awesome. Okay. All right, y'all. So as you recall, we have just one route here because we're building vertically. How would I start to define my index route here?
You just put def index.
Yep.
And then n.
Mm-hmm. And what do I actually want in here? If we're thinking about our RESTful routes and thinking about coding this RESTfully, what data is going to be in my index routes?
All the data to render JSON.
Yeah, so we're going to definitely render JSON, but the specific data that we're rendering is all of the syllabus. I'm gonna be you know, consistent here, and I'm gonna say syllabuses and do syllabi.all. And someone mentioned rendering JSON. How am I doing that on line 5? What's the syntax for that? What do I do here?
Render JSON : add syllabuses.
Just like this?
I believe that's it. I should look at my code.
Without the extra S.
Without the extra S, yes. That would be helpful. But yes, we want to, instead of rendering an ERB file or anything like that, right? We are actually going to go ahead and render our JSON here. Awesome. And then, you know, moving forward, we're also going to add a create a little later, and we're going to go through that as well. But let's see how we're going with our order of operations here, right? So we have in our console, we've generated our syllabus controller, and we're working on building out our relevant routes. But before we move on to our create, how can we test this? Also, Meg, I know you left a place where we can look at our routes here. So let me run my controller, run my what's it called? My server, and also get that extra view. Because like you said, it is definitely more readable when you look at your routes in the browser here. Awesome.
Yeah, yep. Once someone told me about that, I never looked back.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think this is probably also a good note to add in the notes here.
It gives you the paths too, which is nice, like if you're nesting.
Right.
Or using Devise. Like when I was using Devise in my Rails project, it helps so much.
Yeah, it's definitely helpful, and I'll make sure that that's included in our notes here.
I have a question as far as the controller. I got the impression just from like the lesson and lab for Pokemon that just like the whole Rails section in the front end, that you didn't necessarily have to use instance variables.
You don't. So that's a good point. I can get rid of this, and I do not have to use this, and that's because, so can anyone talk to me through or talk us through why we do not need instance variables here?
Actually, so I had a separate question, but I think my question might be the answer to this one, is that when you're dealing with the views, you have to pass the instance variable to the view, but when it's JSON, you're just rendering it directly. So in a really way, this is actually much easier than having to deal with the views. I mean, I don't know if it's much easier, but it just seems like it would be.
Yeah, so you're totally right. We do not need instance variables here because usually we're rendering that data also in an ERB. And the only way we're going to be able to maintain that data through into our view file is going to be creating an instance variable. When we're redirecting, we don't need an instance variable, right? Because we're redirecting to a different route. But when we're just rendering an ERB, we do need to maintain that instance variable. So good point, y'all.
When you're creating and updating though, then you would need to use an instance variable. Is that?
When we're creating and
like if you're creating a new, it wouldn't.
Nope.
Because it's still using Atom. It's still using fetch, the fetch request. So it's still going between the front end and the back end instead of passing the view like throughout Ruby. It's fetching from JavaScript and Ruby. So that's how the data's getting passed.
So like when you look at Rail API code, sometimes you see static. Is that, maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but essentially are all of those, indexes, routes in the controller, are they basically, maybe I'm misusing the word static, but are they basically all static things and then just the fetch interacts with those things independently, but the controller doesn't interact with itself?
Yeah, I think you're misusing the word static. I can go over it with you privately if you want.
So I think this is a good question that most folks are probably wondering too. Like, how is this different now that we're in JavaScript, right? And really the main difference is, oh, y'all can't see what I'm looking at. The main difference here is that, right, when we make a fetch request so this actually may help. Now that I have my route set up, what can I do in here? How would I see that JSON data in my browser? Localhost 3000 / what?
Syllabuses?
Close.
Would it be the API version 1 syllabuses?
Yeah, exactly. So this is what I see when I make a fetch request to this route. This is my index route. So where is, right? So Back's API v1 syllabuses, this is my get route. This is my index, right? Pointing to the controller action index. So essentially, Adam, what's happening is I am going to make a fetch request on my front end, a get request to this route. That is going to return an index of all of my syllabi in my database, but just in JSON format. And I'm going to be able to then render that using JavaScript and rendering it using DOM manipulation. But the static word is almost not sufficient, mainly because like we're also able to make post requests and patch requests, right? That are really going to have some logic in it, and our Rails application is going to have to know what to do with that. So they are dynamic in that route when we're actually communicating with the server. But here, because it's just a simple GET request, we're just plain old rendering.
Adam, I think like what you're thinking about is because like the information it's new information being put into Rails and it's like changing. That has to do with part of the fetch request with the headers that you add to the fetch request for a create and an update. And that you like add the JSON stringify, and you have like a body that it makes sure that Rails can read that data. So it can take it in and have it as just a simple variable it doesn't need to like save it between controller action.
Yeah, and we're going to go over fetch requests in part 3. So in part 3, we're going to go over, okay, now that we have these routes and we have these endpoints and I'm seeing some JSON in my server, how do I actually communicate with the server and get that JSON data in my front end? But I think seeing a create route build out could also be helpful too. So how would I start to build out my create route for creating a new syllabus? Like what's the first thing I have to do here?
Syllabus.new.
Yeah, so I could do syllabus.new. That's exactly right.
And you have to assign it to something, I guess, right?
Exactly. So it would be.
And not an instance variable, just a local.
Yeah, it could just be a regular old variable. And then I would want to take in something here. What would I want to take in?
Strong params.
That's exactly right. So we haven't actually declared this yet, but we know it'll probably be called syllabus params. And then to create our strong params, we'll create a private method down here and name them syllabus params. Right. And then what does this look like?
So I have a question about this.
Yeah.
I know you're supposed to require the class name as well.
Mm-hmm.
Running into troubles, and in the end, I just was like permitting the params and getting it just couldn't work out. I don't have the sort of stamina to go through and work out why that was happening.
Yes. So someone walk me through that require params permit that Sushi's talking about. What does that syntax look like?
It's require syllabus.
If I can spell require right.
And then dot permit, or wait.
Just dot permit?
Shoot, I forget. It's been so long since we're.
Me too.
You say what the I forget the exact syntax, but basically what you're permitting is all the
dot permit
the specific things that you want to allow in
it's
there.
params dot require
Person permit
params dot require syllabus dot permit, and then the attributes, but all of the parameters are symbols.
Right. So then that would be title, description. That would be
URL,
image,
and category ID.
Exactly. So we also have category ID.
Something I don't, just like a comment, and I don't, for clarification, because this is something that always bothered me. So when I see require and permit, like just the English, just the way that we talk about something being required and permitting something, always would throw me off. So, and because if it's requires something, but then you're allowing it to the stuff, but you're like, hey, it's already required. So it's almost like permit really means needs, right? Like NEEDS.
No, okay. So there's a couple of things, right? So basically requiring this top level hash, and we're permitting these attributes. So that's kind of like the nature of strong params is we're permitting only these attributes to be taken into our database and creating a new instance, right? So we are in fact permitting specific attributes here, right? And this kind of saves us from injection attacks on our front end and things of that nature, where we are, first of all, requiring like this top level hash of syllabus, and then we're only permitting these attributes. And Sushi, what we'll see in our next session is what I think happened with what was giving you trouble is because we have this top level hash, if we were to actually like look into our console and see how this prints out, if we had a form that could actually send this data, we would see that this is nested. So in our fetch request, we also have to send this back nested as well. And we'll talk about that in part 3. But okay, so we have a syllabus attribute here, and then we can do, right, like if this thing saves, right, I want to be able to actually execute some code here, else, right, like we're going to do something else. If this saves, what do I want to do?
Render.
Yeah, exactly. I want to render the JSON, right? You've earned it. It's saving successfully. And I'm going to, again, pass it that variable. And I'm also going to do a status here, which we'll talk about a little bit later after we kind of finish building this out. But this allows us to send basically status codes to our, kind of like with our fetch requests, telling the user on the front end or the client on the front end when we're coding, okay, whether this was accepted and rejected, and kind of like why. So if this is failing, what do I want to do? I want to render something. What can I render here?
An error message.
That's exactly right. I can render kind of some errors here using this syntax, this error syntax. I can like render it as full messages here. And again, like we just said, I can kind of pass it this status code. I'm going to say unprocessable entity, which I don't know if y'all have seen this yet, but I'll go over it in just a moment. I'm going to make sure I'm like toggle soft wrap here so y'all can see all this. All right, so I'm creating a new syllabus instance with my strong params here. And I'm saying, okay, if this saves correctly, right? This may not save correctly once in the future we have some validations and stuff in place. Then go ahead and render that data, right? It's accepted, we're all good. Render that single JSON object. Else, we're gonna render some errors, and we can send this to our front end and actually display these errors to the user, right? So if our validations has errors, something like, you know, must have image URL, or image must be a URL, or must have a title, must have a description, description can't be any shorter than however many characters, we can actually display those full messages to the front end. And I have this create, which means I also need to add it to my routes here. And then if we were to, again, right, we can check our routes here. Before, we just had an index, a get index, right, pointing to our index controller action. If I were to refresh this, we now also have a post, same path, but different method here. Now I'm going to take a quick break so we can answer any questions y'all may have had as we worked through this. But if we were to look at our controllers, right, we've done this step. We're looking at our order of operations guide here. We've done this step, ran our generator. We've built out our relevant models for MVP, right? We're only going to focus on index and create for MVP. That is it, right? That's going to have 2 fetch requests for us on the front end. And that will satisfy MVP and the project requirement. So we're only going to focus on those 2. We have actually fetched from our resource to see all of our JSON data in index. So controllers is done. And I know we kind of did something that may have been unfamiliar to some folks. So I do want to make sure that we review that. Specifically, go ahead.
Diana, I was going to ask if you could, oh wait, you have that code in the notes. Okay. I was going to ask if you could go back to the controller.
Yeah. So I want to kind of review what we just did, and then I'll open it up for questions about the controller. So what we first did was we're rendering all syllabi in the form of JSON here in our index route. Again, we talked about how we don't need these instance variables here, but either way totally works. And then what we're also doing is creating a new syllabus based on whatever syllabus params we get from our front end. So this method allows us to create a brand new syllabus and then render that data. Or, right, if it fails, we get to render some errors. We're sending out our syllabus params to permit whatever parameter name, title, description, image URL, and category ID, right? And kind of as a prelude or as like a foreshadowing to our next session, these attributes must be included in the body of our post or patch requests when we're making our JavaScript fetches in part 3. So these attributes, right, need to be included in the body if we're going to create a new instance of that thing. Lastly, what we did was we are setting a status based on the successful save, right? So we can check, I have these 2 links for y'all here, but this unprocessable entity one here on this line, getting an error, right? If it was not saved properly, that's a status code of 422. And I've linked to that, but I can also real quick go over what that means here. Essentially, it means the server understands the content of the request and the syntax of the request entity is correct, but it was unable to process the contained instructions, AKA everything looks fine and it seems fine, but you failed some validations, you failed some parameters or in some instructions we set up. So we're going to give you an unprocessable entity. It's not a bad request, right? It's not an unsupported media type, but it's this piece. And I wanted to sprinkle in some status code talk for y'all in this project build. And I've linked to this page. I've also linked to this page where you can look at some other status codes if you're curious. But now what I'm going to do is open it up for questions on everything we just did and talked about.
I just have one quick question. I just want to make sure I really understand the syllabus params.
Yeah.
On the private. So just let me know if this sounds correct, right? But you have the parameters require, and would an appropriate analogy be that part, right, is like, it's like a lock, right? You have a lock, and you know how a lock has like, there's certain teeth in the key, and it needs like, you know, maybe 3 teeth out of like 10 or whatever in order to unlock it.
Yeah.
So is it fair to say that what you're getting from the require is like, yo, that's like the lock, right? But then the permit part tells you which teeth of the key need to match the lock?
No, so I see what you're getting at. I would look at this first level as, okay, let's say since like I love, Adam, that you crave analogies. I love that, right? Because this is going to be what is going to allow us to like understand these concepts in kind of like real world examples. So I would say this is more closely to maybe an analogy of there being 2 rooms, right? Okay. The first room is the syllabus room, right? Like that's the first, behind that door. No, let's say there's a syllabus door, right? And okay. This is the first door. It needs to be called syllabus. We're only opening a door named syllabus. Not opening any other doors in our params hash. Okay. And all that we are going to permit coming through that door and into our database room is an object called a thing in the room called a title, a thing in the room called a description, a thing in the room called an image URL, and a thing in the room called a category ID.
Oh,
nothing else is coming through that door. Nothing else is coming through that syllabus door, and nothing. It's not coming into our database. We're not going to allow it.
So to take it one step further, if it said like define like bake a cake params require would be like the pantry, and then permit would be like flour and baking, so like all the stuff that you're bringing out.
So this is what I'll do. I think it would be helpful to include a note here on strong params, because I see a lot of y'all are, yeah, there's also some talk in the chat about some analogies here and what works best for understanding this concept. And I'll send over some documentation on strong params. But essentially, like, this allows us to, like, quote unquote sanitize our params, so we're not accepting bad data into the database. Rails requires us to do this, or we are not able to actually, like, use our params from a fetch request or a Rails form, right, to do this. And I can send y'all some more documentation on this, but since strong params is something that would kind of be like review, I'm going to send some more resources on this, and then we'll continue in Slack if you have some more questions about this piece, or in our office hours. Cool.
Thank you.
Of course, of course. But yeah, I agree. Like, this is something that's super important. And I definitely think we should spend some time talking about it. And I think I have a Sinatra and Rails office hours tomorrow. We can pick up that conversation there. So if anyone else is curious about this, come to those office hours tomorrow, and we'll kind of, like, pick up the discussion there. Our controller, though, is looking good. Our controller is looking good. Does anyone have any questions about this controller before we move on to actually building and talking about our serializers here, or building and talking about the fast JSON API serializer?
Do this.
Let's do it. Cool. All right, so I mentioned I will actually work on this feature in a new branch, because for the folks that weren't here in part one, I want them to be able to see kind of like this different development flow. And for that, what I'm going to do is, well, let me ask y'all this. How do I create a new branch while I'm in my master?
Get CO-B in the name.
That's exactly right, Connie. So basically get checkout -B, that's branch. This allows me to create a new branch here and then check out to that new branch at the same time. And what I'm going to do here is I'll just name this serializers. We'll build both on this branch. Cool. So before I was on master branch, now I am on this branch. And if I do get branch, I can see kind of like what all my other branches and what branch I'm on. We see other branches from our last coding session. So now I'm officially in a new branch. I've inherited all the code that's on master, but I'm now going to actually build out that serializer functionality in a different branch. Cool. So the controller looks good to me. We're not able to test this yet because we do not have any, like, form on our front end or anything. But we're actually going to, we're going to work on that next week in part 3. In the meantime, if we're looking at our order of operations guide here, right? Controllers is done. Now we're moving on to the fast JSON like API serializer, right? And this walkthrough and information about the fast JSON API serializer is in the curriculum, but let's actually walk through how we would get that installed here in this application. The first step is we need to add this gem to our, I'm gonna also do a markdown preview so it's a little easier to read for y'all.
Hey, Ayana, a question about this.
Yeah.
Since I mean, our thing isn't super involved, since we have, like, not too many models planned out, and working just, I mean, I only worked with it briefly, but working with the fast JSON, it's, like, pretty damn complex, like,
It is.
for
It is.
something not too heavy.
Right.
Would you suggest, like, everybody use this for their project, or really just kind of build out a serializer, like, and, like, they had us walk through in the Rails lessons?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would recommend getting experience, getting practice with the fast JSON API serializer. It's super common and it's really, really powerful. So I think kind of exposing yourself to it in a project, albeit a very small project, is going to ultimately make you more comfortable in case you see this on an open source project you're contributing to, or you know, when you're on a dev team, maybe you're going to a hackathon or something's like, someone's like, let's use fast JSON API serializer. You want to put yourself in a position where you've exposed yourself to popular technologies. So in this case, while we don't need it, I think it just only helps to get some practice with implementing it. And as we'll see, it is complex. Like it totally transforms our data structure. But I think ultimately it exposes us to the power of it. And I think seeing how complex the data structure becomes kind of gives us a hint as to like, oh, okay. So when our database and our relationships are super, super complicated, this API actually becomes a really helpful tool. The issue I do have with the JSON API serializer is we can't really like customize the data structure, which is what a custom serializer allows you to do. When you're like making your own serializer, you can kind of control how you get access to that data. But it's a very powerful tool, and I kind of talk about that in our notes down here. Like we kind of intro it, and we kind of talk about what's happening under the hood there.
I mean, it's definitely, like, I did mess around with it a lot in, I think it was the Pokemon lab.
Yeah.
And read a lot of the documentation, and it's totally powerful and everything. So I definitely see what you're saying. So it's something to have on your portfolio. I have experience with this.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
That's exactly right.
Thank you.
Okay. Of course. So this gem is now in our gem file. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a bundle install here. Awesome. So now that gem is bundled, we can now move on to actually, right? So this gem gives us access to a new generator called serializer. We do not have access to this generator without that gem. So now in here, we can actually give this generator our resource name here. And as I mentioned, we're just going to go ahead and do both serializers just for the time being. So let's first go ahead and do Rails G serializer. And granted, I know we haven't actually built out our syllabus, our category controller or routes yet, but just while we're on this branch, I figured it made sense to just go ahead and generate these guys. All right, so we're generating that serializer, and then we're also generating category as well. Cool. Let's check to see what that did for us. So our API folder is now, our app folder is now green. And then our serializer folder is green, hinting to us like there's some new fun in here. All right, so we have our syllabus serializer and our category serializer. We're not gonna touch category just yet. And I'm also creating both of these serializers because I wanna show y'all why a serializer is a good thing to even add. Some folks ask, do we need a serializer for our JavaScript project? No, you don't need one, but it's something you want. And we're actually going to go into that in just a moment. But let's jump back to our order of operations guide here. So I have gone ahead and generated my serializers, but I need to actually also update my controller actions to include this new syntax, because I'm no longer just plain old rendering the JSON from my database. I'm like kind of creating a new instance of my syllabus serializer and passing it that argument. Since I have this code here and we're kind of running low on time, I'm just going to copy that and I'm going to plop that in our syllabus controller.
Ayana, quick question as you're doing this. If you don't need it, right? What is it replacing that we're not like? Yeah.
So that's what we're actually about to see. So kind of hold this vision in your mind, right? This is just what rendering our syllabus from our database looks like. Also, side note, if you do not have the JSON viewer extension downloaded, you should do that. This allows you to see your JSON data in a much more readable way. So download that Chrome extension or whatever extension for whatever browser you're doing. You want some sort of JSON viewer extension, which is what allows me to look at my JSON in this helpful way. So this is, Adam, what it looks like with no serializer. Let's actually see what it looks like now that I have added that new line in my controller. So we've added line 6. Instead of just rendering the syllabus attribute, variable, I'm now going to render a new instance of my syllabus serializer with that syllabus's data. Let's take a look at that. In Chrome, I think I also have to make sure my terminal, my what's it called? Server is running. Cool. So let's go ahead and refresh this. So that's how it changed. So this is currently what our serializer is doing. The biggest difference here is we now have this data top level object where my array is, and then we have type. But what am I missing in here?
Attributes that you need to bring in.
Exactly. I need to actually bring in those attributes, because as we saw, I really wasn't able to see any of those attributes that I was able to see before I implemented that serializer. So let's fix that. So I believe there's a title, a description, an image URL, and then there's also, right, if I wanted to show the user, if I wanted to show that in my API what the category ID was, I could also, no, that's wrong.
Hey, I'm trying to like remember the other screen, but is the main difference that the syllabus serializer gives you an array, whereas the other one was just the hash? Is that the difference?
Okay, so let's see. So this is the, okay. I'm not able, all right, so let's go back here and let's comment this back in. All right, so for folks who want to do a comparison, go ahead and take a screenshot of this. Go ahead and capture this. So it's just an array at the very, very top level. And then we have our object in here, right? Whereas now that there is a serializer, save that. Let's go back to our browser. Top level array. We can just, as soon as we'll get this data back, making this call on our front end, we're just going to get an array of data. Now with the serializer, we have a data object that we're getting that has our array. And then within that array are going to be our individual syllabus objects. And in that object, which you can see right here, we have an attributes object, which has our attributes in that object. So it becomes a little bit more nested. And this, in a way, is kind of a power, kind of a telltale sign of how kind of scalable this serializer becomes, because it's nesting these attributes and nesting our data in a way that is very, very descriptive. It makes it easier when we're like, because our project is very small, it seems like it doesn't make it easier. But if you had a very, very complex API, you'd want an attributes key, right? You'd want kind of the specificity that the JSON API lends itself to. But this isn't really nesting, Lovely. Yeah, it could be very annoying, but it becomes helpful the more complex your API gets.
But it's front end with code. I mean, you think like, well, you can't just use array methods, you know, to just grab in there and operate on your data. You've got to first destructure it and, you know, get it out of the object and then into an array, and it fries my head.
Yeah. So you could use an array method. It would just be like JSON.data, right? And then you would use the array method on that. But then in order to like access these individual attributes, you'd have to do like attributes.title, right? So it just becomes like the best thing to do is going to be to like pop in debuggers and like play around with how to access the data there. And this is again what we'll do in part 3, which is like really figuring out, okay, how we're going to like traverse and like drill down into this API to get the data we want and do the DOM manipulation that we need to do. But this doesn't really reflect the beauty of a serializer, right? So the beauty is that we can kind of restrict the attributes. So let's say, right, currently there's a category ID and people don't need to see the category. Like we don't need to see the category ID. We can just get rid of that, save that attribute, and we get some control over like what's, let's see, we got a syntax error here.
I have a quick question. We probably don't need to get into it, but if you used a serializer and there were many levels of nesting and you had like millions of things of data, wouldn't that screw up like the stuff for the big O notate? Like, wouldn't it make your app really slow if you had to like traverse a bunch of different nested levels?
Well, no, it depends on how you're getting
how it's set up. Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So now we saw with this serializer, right, I was able to get rid of that category ID. So the beauty is that we can kind of control what gets rendered in our JSON data. But my favorite thing is we can create and display associations in here. And if I just wanted to display the category object associated with this syllabus object, which is probably something I'm gonna wanna do, right? There's maybe something in my front end where I'm having syllabus cards, and for each syllabus card, I want to show the category that it belongs to, right? For my serializer, I could I'll add that category ID in there because like, why not? You never know. But then I can also access that association by just typing in that category object, that category macro. This will allow me to access the association of my syllabus. So now that the only difference, right, is I've added this category attribute here, this as like within the attributes. And now if I refresh, I see the associated category in my attributes object. So this becomes helpful because on the front end, I can do, okay, for each syllabus card, iterate over JSON.data, right? Iterate over this array. And then for each, I want to display attributes.title, attributes.description, attributes.image URL. But then I also want to display attributes.category.name. And I can essentially access that relationship with one fetch call. I see folks making multiple fetch calls without serializers, making multiple fetch calls to to like access that association. So getting the syllabus and then getting the categories and kind of like doing some logic to connect the two, when really a serializer allows you to do this in a very, very kind of like easy and nifty way. Cool. So this is one way you can do it. There's also another way, which y'all may have seen in some of the labs, where instead of just tacking it right here, you can include it in your in your controller here. So what that looks like, it's a little different. But what that looks like is you're going to want to have some sort of options. And I believe you can name this whatever you want. But you're going to want to like write include associated relationship here. But for me, it's going to be category. Whatever yours is going to be. What I want to display is category. And in order to do that, I'm just going to write include. Make sure I get that syntax right. Category. I could include whatever other associations are on this syllabus. It's really looking at this argument is looking at what is in my models, right? So if this category relationship is not in syllabus, this would not work, right? Let's say syllabus has many users. It would be users here, right? Because users would be plural, or has many would be plural. So whatever is included in these square brackets has to match your associations in here, because that's how the serializer is going to make this connection for you.
But you can do that on the index as well?
Yeah.
That's sweet.
Yeah, we can do this options thing anywhere. And in any controller action, I should say. And then so what that will look like here is I would now also pass it that options object that we just created. So now let's take a look at how this is. Then also I would need to, there's one last thing I need to do in here. What's the last thing? In order to see that, in order to like add relationships to our API.
And put the has many.
Exactly. In this situation, it would be belongs to, right? So belongs to category, right? So I would also have to be explicit about that relationship here. And then, right, have this options object that I'm now passing to the new instance of the serializer. And I'm gonna make sure we pause for questions before we go, because I know we're running out of time here. But if we kind of remember, this is what it looked like before we had that options object, where category, we can just access it straight through attributes, which, you know, sometimes just does the trick, right? Like sometimes this is all you need. But other times, maybe we want to go a little bit further and have a relationships object, right? That we're able to, oh, okay, so we're not done here, but look, this is what's happening now. We now have this relationships object. We also have this like included array. But I want to actually add some attributes, right, to this category. How would I actually go ahead and do that? How does that work with my serializers?
Well, the category has a name, right? Is that what we're going to add?
That's exactly right, Connie. We need to add a name. This is why I wanted to create both serializers at the same time, because I want to display that name of my associated category, and I needed to add that attribute here in this category serializer. Okay. I just had a moment where I thought I wasn't recording this whole entire time, y'all. All right, so I'm gonna refresh this page.
Got you, don't worry.
Thanks. So yeah, now we see that that name is included in our in along with our category. So I wanted to show y'all both ways. This is also included in our project build notes, right? So we go through, okay, what the syllabus serializer needs to look like if we wanted to add that relationship there, and how we would pass that options attribute in. Personally, I don't like all of like the object bloat that happens with all of this. So what I like to do when it's something as simple as like showing a belongs to, what I like to do is just in our syllabus serializer, we can like just go ahead and do category here and access it through the attributes. It's just going to make it easier on us when we start to do our fetch requests on the front end. But I did want to show y'all kind of like, I'll just comment this out for folks who want to actually see that. And then I'll also make I don't know if this is going to be more confusing or not, but I'll also make another comment down here. But y'all, we are at 12:30. Does anyone have any questions? I do want to make sure I get to your questions before we log off. And I'm going to commit, push, and merge this branch. So I'll do that in just a moment. But while I'm typing these comments, I want to also pause for questions.
So the first method you showed was just using the serializers alone to show those relationships.
Yes.
And then the second one was a combination of serializer and adding like options to the controller.
Right.
So if you wanted to show the attribute of that is the attributes on that associated object,
right,
the only way to do that would be the second option.
No, so you can do it for both. When you're adding a relationship to the serializer, you could show the attributes for category and syllabus. You just have to make sure that whatever associated model also has attributes in it.
Can you show the JSON again then? Because we didn't have it the first time we went through. We didn't have name on that category serializer the first time.
Right, because I didn't have, oh, okay, I see what you're saying. So, all right. So now we figured out all this stuff and we're just now displaying the new serializer with these attributes here, and we're just accessing the attribute, the category in this attribute. So what we're going to do now is, let's go ahead and refresh that. And then we should see the name now.
Okay, cool.
Right, because I didn't have that name attribute in there the first time. That was a good call.
And it automatically has the created at and updated at. Yeah,
so I know there's a way you can like get rid of this, but it automatically comes with it.
That's weird because it doesn't have it for
the attributes. Yeah.
The attributes.
And it doesn't have it for the syllabus either.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Yeah. So I wonder if in my schema, that's just how it was set up. So let's see. DB schema.
You know what? I think I saw something.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm wondering why that may be, but I guess that can be an open question for the next time, right? But if we go to our order of operations here, right, we have now completed our fast JSON serializer. And then, right, we also tested it to confirm that it was like working as we expected it to. And then, right, to wrap this up, what I'm going to do offline is build out the category controller as well. And that really is going to wrap up all the steps for building out our API here, y'all. We went through kind of like the first step for us was looking at our routes here. And we did that, again, building vertically and just focusing on one resource at a time. And then we moved on to one controller and just built out our routes for MVP, right? And our code for MVP. That's all we were caring about. And then we decided, okay, we need a serializer because we want to show and display associated data in our JSON. We want to be able to, on the front end, display our associations. So we created that JSON, we created that serializer, or implemented that serializer, I should say, using the fast JSON serializer, and walk through kind of like the different reasons why we care about a serializer, but then also the different ways in which we can implement it as well, and what that ends up looking like in our JSON data. So we went through a lot here, and I'm now going to like add all of that code because we saw it working. We tested it in our endpoint, and we know that that serializer is working as expected. So I'm going to commit, basically implemented syllabus and category. So serializers, I like chose 2 words, and I'm like, I don't know how to spell. All right, and we're gonna push this branch up. And again, this is kind of a review from last time. So for folks that saw me do this last time, what I do now is I like to go into my repo here, and I'll see this pushed up branch. I can do compare and pull requests here. You can also, if you have GitHub in your Atom or wherever your, whatever text editor you use, you can also do this locally. You can do this in your console. You can merge in your console. But I kind of like, I like going this route. And then you can do delete branch here. And now, right, you'll see that we have this kind of, we have our serializer code somewhere. Yep, implemented syllabus and category serializer. So now what we'll do in our terminal is we are going to get checkout to the master branch, and we are going to do a git pull to get that data, to get all of that code that we created in that separate branch. And now we know our master branch has some working code. We did not merge that serializer branch before we had that serializer working. And now, right, if I were to run Rails S, I should see my JSON data in here behaving as expected and in the same way.
Can you pull up your schema one more time?
For sure. All right, let's look at that. Oh, I just closed it. There we go.
Okay, because I'm just comparing it to the lab, and in the lab, it's SQLite, and I think it's yeah, it's Rails 5.2. So, because it didn't automatically include the created at and updated at, so that might have something to do with that too. But
Automatically include what these
created at, yeah, it didn't automatically include those attributes. But
yeah, possibly, but yeah, y'all, we'll look into that for next time. But in the meantime, I'm going to build out the controllers for our category. And then in part 3, we will go over DOM manipulation events and fetch using this Rails API. And we'll do a GET request and a POST request. We'll also go over this JavaScript mantra that I love, that my teacher Ann taught to me in DC, on the DC campus. But yeah, y'all, we're like way over time. Anyone have any questions before we go?
no.
Cool.
Did
All right,
you-
y'all.
I have just like a quick question. You said the DC campus, so you did in person at DC?
Yeah, so I'm gonna